4 Apache sisters refused to be separated, even facing death. He took all 4. The rope was still warm when I cut it. That's the thing I think about first when I think about that morning. Not the sound the camp had made before I rode into it, 3 men and the ugly work they'd been at, not the way the cottonwood branches had been stripped bare and white in the cold. I think about the rope, how it held heat the way a living thing does. How my knife went through it slow because the hemp had twisted tight under their weight, and how I kept cutting anyway, kept pulling it apart strand by strand while my horse stood ground-tied 30 feet back, and the 3 men who'd strung it there were laid out in the mesquite where I'd put them. I'd been coming down the canyon wall when I saw it from above. First light, the sky that particular shade of gray before it decides what color it wants to be, and I'd been looking for a way down to the creek to water my horse. I saw the fire first, then the cottonwood, then the shape of what was hanging from it. I'd put my horse to the slope before I'd finished thinking it through. I wasn't supposed to be in that canyon. I was supposed to be 2 days southeast of there, picking up a string of horses from a man named Aldous Frey, who owed me money from a card game in Tascosa the previous spring. Instead, I was standing in the cold of a New Mexico morning, cutting a rope off 4 Apache girls who'd been strung up by their wrists from a cottonwood branch and left. Not hanged, left. Which I came to understand later was its own particular kind of cruelty, the intention being to come back, to find them there, to use the waiting, the cold, the helplessness as a tool. The oldest one was maybe 19 or 20. She had a cut above her left eye that had gone to crust in the night and a bruise along her jaw shaped like a hand. She didn't look at me when I cut her down. She looked past me, toward the mesquite, checking. When she was satisfied that the 3 men in the brush weren't going to get up, she turned her eyes back to me, direct and flat, without fear exactly, without gratitude either, and said something in Apache that I didn't understand but understood completely. She was asking if I was going to be a problem. I told her I wasn't. She didn't believe me. That was fair. A man she'd never seen appearing out of the gray dawn, 3 other men dead in the brush. A reasonable woman in her position would not have believed me either. I understood this and didn't push it. I gave her room to look at me and decide what she was looking at, and I went about starting a fire in the ring the men had left and putting coffee on to boil. The other 3 were younger, 15, maybe 12, and the littlest one I'd have put at 8 or 9, though she was thin enough it was hard to say. They'd been hanging since at least the night before. Their fingers had gone bad colors from the rope and the cold, dark at the tips, and the littlest one was shaking and hadn't stopped shaking since I'd gotten her down. I had hardtack and dried venison and a pot of coffee because it was all I had, and I set it out and stepped back from it. The oldest one watched me do this. Then she organized her sisters the way a woman organizes things she has organized many times before, quick, certain, no wasted motion, and she fed the littlest first, then the 12-year-old, then the 15-year-old, and then sat back and watched me from across the fire while her sisters ate. She didn't eat herself until I handed her the last of the venison directly and walked away to tend my horse. Whether she understood that I was trying to give her some privacy for it or thought I was simply uninterested, I don't know. Either way she ate. I didn't know, standing there with my back to the fire and my hand on my horse's neck, what I was getting into. I found out over the course of the next several hours, as we worked our way out of that canyon and up onto the flats north of it. She had some Spanish, more than she let on at first. I had a few dozen words of Apache, picked up over years of working country where you needed them. Between that and what she was willing to say and what I could read in the way she moved and watched the country, I got the shape of it. Their parents were dead. Their village, what remained of it after a raid 3 weeks prior, had been scattered. The raid had not been Comanche or Apache or anyone you'd have expected. It had been men working for a land company out of Santa Fe that wanted the canyon and the water rights to the creek that ran through it. And what they'd done to the village was a way of making an argument. The 3 men in the mesquite had been part of the same outfit. I asked if there were more of them. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a man who's asked a question with a foolish answer. Right, there were more. She also told me about the brother, though not much. His name, the direction he'd gone when the raid came, a particular look on her face when she said it, not grief exactly, because grief was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford, something more controlled and more costly. She didn't say more about the brother, and I didn't ask. My name is Caleb Dunn. I was born in Tennessee in 1828, and I have not been back there since I was 17, when I left on foot with a pack on my back, and a settled determination not to die poor and ordinary the way every man in my family before me had died, dying with their hands still dirty from someone else's field, dying with their backs still bent from someone else's load. Whether I accomplished something different depends on what you're measuring. I have lived more life than most men, and I have the scars to account for it, inside and outside both. And by 51 years old, I had arrived at a particular philosophy about how to manage the rest of it. The philosophy was simple: owe nothing, be owed nothing. Move clean through the world, do your work well, take your pay, and don't let anyone get close enough to need you or need anything from you. The only way you lose something is if you let it become yours. The only way someone leaves is if they had somewhere to leave from. I had held to that philosophy for 7 years, which is long enough for a philosophy to feel like a personality. The wife in Abilene had tried, genuinely tried, the way a good woman tries with a man who is trying to be a wall. Her name was Frances, and she was from Illinois, and she had more patience than I deserved, and less than the situation ultimately required. She'd tried for 3 years. She left when the freight line went under, and I went cold and distant in the way I went cold and distant when things fell apart, which was not useful to her, and the note on the kitchen table said more about my failures than hers. I'd read it standing in that empty kitchen in the December cold with the smell of her last pot of coffee still in the room, and I decided she was right about everything she'd said, and that the correct lesson was to stop setting up the kind of situation where a note like that gets left. The correct lesson was the wall. The correct lesson was owing nothing. I was a scout before all that. Army through my mid-30s, working the Chihuahuan Desert mostly, which shapes a man in specific ways, takes out some things and replaces them with other things, and doesn't ask whether you'd prefer the original. I'd seen enough and done enough in those years that I came out the other side with a set of skills that were entirely practical and a set of feelings that were in serious disrepair. I'd run cattle after, then the freight operation out of Abilene, then some other things I don't discuss in polite company, none of which were bad exactly, or not all of which were bad, but none of which were the kind of thing you describe in a letter home if you're still writing to anyone back home. I'd gotten hard in the particular way the frontier gets men hard, not mean, I don't think, or not always mean, but stripped down. Economical, without much excess left over. A man who got his work done and was good at it and didn't need the work to be anything other than work. That was who I was the morning I came down the canyon wall and saw the cottonwood. I looked at those 4 girls on their horses and I thought, south, phrase horses, a clean transaction, west to Colorado where I'd been considering some land, the kind of land that doesn't require anyone else, that you can work alone and build alone and live on alone, the way a philosophy like mine requires. I looked at those 4 girls on their horses, I'd put them up on the pack animal and rearranged my gear, and I thought about south, phrase horses, a clean transaction, Colorado. Instead I rode north. I'm not going to dress it up into something it wasn't. It wasn't a noble decision, not in the way that feels clean and bright. It was more like, there wasn't a choice I could make that I'd be able to live with except this one. Sometimes that's the whole of a moral calculation. You strip away the options that leave you not being able to look at yourself in a reflecting surface, and whatever's left is what you do. Her name was Saya. She told me that when we stopped at midday to water the horses at a seep I knew along the base of a sandstone ridge. She told me the others were Kai, Dista, and the little one, Nolly. She said the names quickly and practically, as if they were information I might need to have to be useful, and went back to organizing her sisters for the water stop. She wasn't offering me anything. She was managing the situation, the way she'd been managing the situation probably since the raid and maybe before it. I noticed the way she managed it, the economy of her movements, the way her attention was always distributed, part on whatever immediate task was in front of her, part on the country around her, part on the three younger girls always. She didn't miss anything. The littlest one, Nolly, made a move toward a piece of prickly pear and Saya's hand was there before the thought was complete, redirecting without a word, without breaking whatever else she'd been doing. I noticed this and thought, she has been doing this for a long time, before the raid. This is who she already was. We rode through the afternoon without much talk. Saya set a pace that was harder than I'd have pushed them, given what they'd been through, but I didn't say anything because I could read why. She was watching the ridgelines, the back trail, every gap and cut in the rock where a man could position himself. She'd grown up reading country the way I'd learned to read it, and she was reading it now, and the pace she was setting was the pace she'd calculated was safe. I counted in my head what I knew about the outfit out of Santa Fe. The Delgado operation, 3 brothers, a staff of hired guns, and a lawyer named Reston who was better at his particular work than men like that deserved. They had a territorial judge in their pocket and connections in Washington that were, depending on who you asked, either legitimate or thoroughly bought. They'd taken water rights and land from 3 or 4 different communities in the territory already. They were not a problem with a simple solution. I had 12 rounds for the Winchester and 22 for the Colt. I had 4 days of food if I rationed hard for 5 people, or 2.5 days if the girls ate what they should after what they'd been through, which was what they should do. I had a friend, of a kind named Holtveeder, who ran a trading post at a place called Canyon Largo, 3 days north. Veeder was a man who bent with whatever wind was blowing, but he had a specific debt to me from a few years back, and I'd found that men with specific debts are often more reliable than men with general goodwill. That night we made camp in a draw, and I built the fire small and low, pushed back against the rock to cut the light. Saya settled her sisters with a competence and speed that would have impressed me in a trail hand, let alone a girl who'd been strung from a tree the night before. Dista, the 12-year-old, had a cough she kept pressing her fist against. Nolly had stopped shaking sometime in the late afternoon, but still moved the way small animals move when the danger is recent, low to the ground, close to her sisters, eyes up. Saya sat across the fire from me and watched me clean the Winchester. After a while she said in Spanish, "Why?" I said I didn't know exactly, which was honest. She considered this like it was a real answer. Then she said, "The men, more will come." I said yes. "You know this, and you still came north." I said yes. She looked at the fire for a while, then she said, "You are not young." I told her that was true. She said, "And you have no one." That one sat on me. I turned it over. Then I said that was true also. She nodded, as if that explained something she'd been working out. Then she took a piece of rawhide from somewhere inside her clothing and began braiding it with her fingers in the dark, automatic and sure, and didn't say anything else until I spread my bedroll and told her to sleep. She said she would keep first watch. I said I would keep first watch. We looked at each other across the low fire. Then she lay down between Nolly and Dista and was asleep in what seemed like minutes, or maybe she just controlled her breathing and her stillness the way she controlled everything else, and I kept watch alone and listened to the country around us settle into night. The second day was harder. Dista's cough worsened by mid-morning and Kai, the 15-year-old, who hadn't said more than 3 words since I'd cut her down, was running a fever by the time the sun was well up. I knew enough about fever to know what to watch for, and I watched. By noon, she was not getting better, and I pushed us off the main line toward a place I knew. A dry stream bed with a spring hidden back in the rocks, where a man could disappear for half a day without being visible from any of the approaches. Saya did the nursing. I went a quarter-mile up the slope and found fever grass, the kind the old Mexican women called yerba santa, and brought back what I could carry, and she took it from my hands without comment and set about doing things with it that I recognized in outline if not in detail. She had Kai drink something boiled. She had to chew leaves and swallow. She worked quietly and with the particular kind of focus that closes everything else out, and I let her work and kept watch on the approaches. I watched the land behind us while Kai slept and the other girls rested. The country was clean as far as I could tell, but clean and empty are different things, and I'd learned long ago not to confuse them. In the late afternoon, when the fever had broken enough that Kai was sitting up and sipping water, Saya came and sat on the rock beside me. Not close, a few feet away. She looked at the country the same way I was looking at it. She said, "How many days to your friend?" I said, "1 more, maybe 2 if we kept the pace light for Kai's sake." She was quiet. Then she said, "This friend he will help." I said I thought so, that there was a debt between us and he was the kind of man who remembered debts. She considered this. Then she reached into the fold of her blanket and produced something small, a leather cord with a few beads worked onto it, turquoise and something dark I didn't recognize. She held it out. I looked at it. I said I couldn't take that. She kept her hand out. She said in Spanish, flat and even, "You take it. It is not payment. Payment is not possible for what you did. It is so you know we are not nothing, that we have something to give." I took it. I held it in my palm for a moment, the beads cool and smooth, and then I put it in my breast pocket. I still have it. I will have it until I don't have anything. That evening Kai's fever fully broke. She sat up and ate slowly, and after she ate she looked at me across the fire and said something in Apache. I asked Saya to translate. Saya paused. Then she said her sister was saying, "You are a strange man, but I think you are good." I said to tell Kai I was mostly just old. Saya didn't translate that, but the corner of her mouth moved very slightly and then was still. I noticed. I noted it and put it away and thought about the country ahead of us. Holt Viter's trading post at Canyon Largo was a squat adobe building with a corral in serious disrepair, and a sign that had never been quite readable even when the paint was new. Viter was outside mending a fence post when we came in, working with the particular economy of motion of a man who has convinced himself he's making progress while making none. He was going to fat now, his beard past the point of management, his eyes sharp under all of it. He watched us come in, me, the pack animal, Saya, and the 3 younger girls, and I watched him understand the situation in increments. He said, "Done." I said, "Viter." He looked at the girls, he looked at me. He said, "Apache." I said, "Yes." He said, "Delgado outfit." I said, "Yes." He chewed his beard for a long moment. Then he said, "Hell." Which about covered it. Viter didn't want this trouble. He'd made peace with the Delgado operation the way most men in the territory had, by being invisible to it, by not knowing what he didn't need to know, by keeping his head down and his trade open and his mouth shut. I could see all of that moving across his face, the calculation, the angle he was looking for, the measure of what I was asking him to absorb. And then I saw him remember. The situation with his wife's brother and Cass Pruitt had not been a comfortable thing to handle. I'd handled it anyway because Viter had asked me to, and I'd been in a position to help, and there hadn't been a cleaner option. It had cost me 10 days and a shoulder that ached when it rained, which in New Mexico territory is more often than you'd expect. Viter knew what I'd spent on it. He'd known it since the morning after, when the thing was done, and we were drinking coffee in the same building he was standing in now, and he'd said, "I owe you more than I can likely pay." I told him I'd collect when I needed to. He looked at the girls one more time. Saya looked back at him, level, steady, with Nolly pressed against her hip, and there was something in her eyes that was not a plea. It wasn't a plea. She wasn't asking him for anything. She was simply being looked at and returning it with her full self and letting him make of that whatever he would. Veeder said, "I've got a back room, not much." I said it'd do. He held the door. The back room was not much. It was a storage room with flour sacks and trade goods stacked along the walls, a packed dirt floor, and a small iron stove that vented through the wall and pulled well once it got going. There was only the one way in. I rolled my bedroll across the doorway between the back room and the main store and checked my Winchester and set it where I could get to it in the dark without looking. Saya put her sisters down on the flour sacks and wrapped them in the blankets Veeder had brought without needing to be asked, which I noted and put in the account of what kind of man he was under the weight and the calculation. She arranged the girls with the same efficiency she did everything, Nolly in the middle, the older two on either side, and then sat near the doorway near me, with her back against the wall and her knees up. We didn't talk much. We were awake in the dark together, the trading post quiet around us, and now and then one of us would get up and check the windows and come back without saying anything about what we'd seen, because what we'd seen was nothing, and nothing meant we could sit back down again. There is a kind of companionship in that, in being awake with a person through the same dark, watching the same nothing, waiting for the same thing, the particular kind that doesn't need words and would be made less by them. I am not a man who has had much of that kind of companionship, and I noticed it the way you notice a warmth when you've been cold long enough that you'd stopped expecting to feel it. Toward 2 in the morning she said quietly, not looking at me, "My father was a man who did not sleep when others needed him to sleep." I said he sounded like a capable man. She said he was. She didn't say anything more about him. I didn't ask, but there was something in the way she'd said it, offering it, not as information but as a kind of recognition that I held on to. In the morning I rode out early. And did what I should have done before I brought us here. I rode a wide circle and read sign, and talked to a freighter I crossed at a wash who'd come up from the south and had seen riders 2 days back. He counted 6, working north and east, and I talked to an old Navajo man at a well who told me there had been men asking at Pinyon Spring the day before, describing 4 Apache girls and the Anglo traveling with them. 6 riders, gaining ground, skilled enough to be tracking us, which meant one of them had a specific talent for it, and I needed to account for that. I rode back to Veeder's and told him. He listened and did the arithmetic and said, "You can't stay." I said I knew. He said, "Where will you go?" I had an idea. It was not a good idea in the sense of being certain or comfortable. But it was the only path I could see that had a better end than running until we were run down. 3 years before, working briefly for a surveying outfit, I'd come across a settlement in the high country, a group of mescalero families who'd been in that canyon long enough to build real structures, stone and adobe, tucked into a cut that couldn't be seen from the main trail. The man who ran it was named Natani. We'd spent 2 nights there when the surveying crew had gotten lost in a way that was trending toward dangerous, and he'd helped set us straight. We'd parted on terms that I'd call mutual respect if I were being generous, and simple non-hostility if I were being precise. Whether that, plus a bag of Veeder's tobacco and some flour, would buy shelter for 4 Apache girls and a trouble-bringing white man with 6 riders behind him. That was the question I'd been asking myself the whole ride back. That night I told Saya all of it. The 6 riders, the 2 days, the mescalero settlement, the question at the center of it. I laid it out plainly, the way I'd want someone to lay it out for me, and watched her face while I did. She listened without moving. When I stopped, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You are asking me." I said yes. She looked at me steadily. Mescalero and Chiricahua do not always have easy history. I said I knew. But you believe this man is reasonable. I said I'd found him to be a man who dealt with what was in front of him, rather than with old grievances. She sat with that. She looked toward where her sisters were sleeping, the rise and fall of their breathing, Nolly with her fist curled under her chin the way she always slept. Then she looked back at me and said, "We go." I said, "All right." She said, "But when we get there, you tell him directly who we are, what has happened. You do not speak for us as if we are," she paused, searching, "as if we are packages you are delivering. We are people. You tell him we are people." I said I would. She held my gaze for a moment longer. Something passed across her face, not softness exactly, something more like a decision. Then she went back to her sisters. We left before first light. Veeder stood in the doorway watching us go, and when I looked back he raised one hand. I raised mine. He'd given us a sack of cornmeal and a side of cured pork without being asked and without making it a transaction, and I'd put it in my pack without making it one either. Some things are better not named. The ride to the high country took a day and a half, and it was not easy country. Steep and rocky and cut with arroyos, cold off the peaks at night. But the girls rode without complaint. Kai was fully recovered and rode well. Dista's cough had dried out. And Nolly, the littlest, had developed, somewhere over the past few days, a habit of riding directly behind me rather than beside her sisters, and of watching the country the same way I watched it. I noticed this without commenting on it. She was 8 years old and she had decided something about me, and whatever she decided had led her to position herself at my back, and I found I didn't mind. Saya rode beside me when the trail allowed it. We talked more than we had. Her Spanish had opened up. She'd been conservative with it at first, keeping the language at a distance the way you keep a tool in your belt rather than in your hand until you need it. She'd learned it from a priest at a mission school where she'd been sent for a winter when she was 12. She described the school in a few flat sentences that told me enough. She'd taken the Spanish and left everything else behind when she walked out of it. I told her something about myself. Not the parts I'd rather not tell, but the parts I could, and I found myself telling more than I'd intended. The scouting, the freight line, the wife in Abilene and the note. I don't know why I told her. I told almost no one those things in 7 years. She listened the way she did everything fully, without performing it, without offering sympathy she didn't have occasion to feel. She said, "You stopped believing anyone would stay." I said that was one way to put it. She said, "And now you have 4 people depending on you to stay." I said I'd noticed the irony. She didn't smile. She looked at the trail ahead. Then she said, "Is that a bad feeling?" I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. The weight I'd been carrying since that canyon, not burden exactly, more like ballast. The way a ship needs ballast to sit right in the water. I said no. I said it was strange and heavy but not bad. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Good." Just that word. Then she was watching the country again, and I was watching it too, and we rode the rest of that stretch without talking, which felt like its own kind of conversation. We found Natani's Canyon on the second afternoon, or rather I rode in close enough to let his people find us, which was the appropriate approach, and I knew it. We sat our horses in the open and waited. After a while 2 young men came down off the rocks. They looked at me, then at Saya, then at the girls. One went back up. The other stayed about 40 feet off, watching. Natani came down himself 20 minutes later. He was older than I remembered, thinner, the way men get in their 60s when the country has been working on them for long enough. His eyes were the same, a particular kind of attention that takes in everything and offers nothing back until it's ready. He looked at me. He said, in English that was considerably better than I remembered, "Caleb done?" I said yes. He looked at Saya and the girls. He looked back at me. I said, "I owe you a good turn. I'm here to collect." He said, "That is very direct." I said I'd found direct worked better in my experience than working around to things. He looked at Saya. He spoke to her in Apache, a different dialect from hers but not incomprehensible, the way Spanish from different regions is different but navigable. She answered him. She spoke for a while and I stayed still and let her speak because this was what I'd promised her. When she finished, Natani was quiet for a moment. Then he said to me, "She says you are a man who acts without stopping to decide whether to act. She says this is rare." I said I didn't know if that was flattering. He said, "She means it as information. Whether it is flattering depends on what you do with it." He looked at the girls one more time. Then he looked at me with that same contained attention and said, "You may come in." The settlement was larger than I'd remembered and more alive, children and old people and dogs, cookfire smoke, the sound of the spring. We were given a stone room at the edge of the canyon, low door, hearth that drew clean. The girls went in and I stood outside for a moment and looked at the canyon walls around us, the height of them, the single narrow approach, and thought, this is defensible. This is good ground. That night there was real food, a stew of venison and dried corn, and the girls ate until Saya stopped them gently, knowing what happens when starved people eat too fast. Natani and I sat outside after and smoked, and he told me about the Delgado riders who'd come to the edge of his territory 2 years back and what had happened to them, and why they hadn't come back. I listened to this and felt something settle in my chest that had been wound tight for days. He said, "The girls, how long do they need?" I said I didn't know yet, that I needed to go back out and read the sign on the riders behind us and see what they were doing. He nodded. He said, "Stay as long as you need." I said I was grateful. He smoked for a while. Then he said, "The oldest one has been carrying those 3 for a long time." I said yes, since before the raid, I thought. He said, "She needs to put the weight down for a while." I said yes. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite a smile. Then he went inside. I kept my own counsel about what he'd meant by that. Or I tried to. I sat outside in the cold for a while looking at the stars and thinking about Saya's face and the rope still warm in my hand and the weight of the beads in my breast pocket. And then I went inside and lay down and slept better than I had since the canyon. We stayed 11 days. I will tell you what those 11 days were like because they are the part I find myself coming back to most now, years later. Not the men in the mesquite, not the long cold rides, those 11 days in the canyon. I should tell you what I was doing with myself in those 11 days, because it wasn't nothing. On the second day, I rode a wide circuit around the canyon approaches, memorizing the ground, finding the places where a man could come in quiet if he knew the country. I found 3. I thought about each of them the way you think about a problem you can't stop working. Natani, when I came back and told him, looked at me with some interest and said that his people had identified the same 3, and that they watched all of them. I said that was good. He said yes. We understood each other on that without needing to say much more about it. On the 4th day, I rode back down to lower country with one of Natani's younger men, a quiet, capable man named Chuya who rode better than almost anyone I'd seen, and we pushed south toward the edge of where the Delgado riders had turned back. We found their camp sign from 2 days before. 6 men, horses well fed, supplies for a long stay. They'd stopped here and held position for a full day before turning back south. Whether they were gone for good or regrouping, the sign didn't say. But they hadn't pressed the perimeter again, and that told me Natani's reputation was holding. I came back and told Saya, not because she needed me to report to her, but because it seemed right. Because she had a stake in it and she'd been treated, for too many weeks, like someone whose stake in things didn't matter. She listened. She asked 2 questions, good ones, practical ones, and then nodded and went back to what she'd been doing. On the 7th day, Nolly brought me a stone she'd found in the creek bed, a piece of red rock with a white stripe through it, and held it out with the seriousness of a very young person making an important gift. I looked at it. I told her it was a good one. She seemed satisfied with this and ran off. Saya had been watching from across the open ground, and when I looked over she was looking at something else, very deliberately, and the corner of her mouth was doing the thing it did. The girls came back. That is the only way I know to say it. Nolly started running again, not to anywhere in particular, not away from anything, just running the way young children run when they've recovered enough from something to simply be alive in their bodies again. She ran back and forth across the open ground inside the canyon, the settlement dogs barking and chasing, her laugh bouncing off the rock walls, and I stood watching it one morning with my coffee in my hand and felt something move in my chest that I was not sure I had a name for. Dista's cough cleared entirely. Kai started talking first to her sisters, then gradually to other young people in the settlement, cautiously, standing at the edge of groups rather than in them. But there. I watched Kai from a distance and thought about what it costs a 15-year-old girl to be present after something like this, to choose presence over nothing, and I thought she was braver than she'd probably ever be given credit for. Saya was different. Not changed, not softened, not diminished. The same woman, but she slept. I don't know when she'd last slept properly, and neither did she, I think. The first night she was up before midnight, checking the canyon entrance the way she'd been checking every approach since the raid. The second night the same. The third night I was awake past 2, and her breathing from the other side of the room was even and deep, and she stayed that way until morning. I lay in the dark and listened to her sleep, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, which was that the world was, in this specific moment, in decent order. She began helping in the settlement the way she helped with everything, without being asked, without performance, simply beginning to do what needed doing. She helped at the cook fires. She helped with the children. She and an older woman from the settlement spent an entire afternoon repairing a section of stone wall at the north end of the canyon that had been failing for what looked like years. I passed them in the late afternoon, and the older woman was talking steadily, and Saya was listening with that particular quality of attention she had, the kind that means she will remember everything and act on it, and the sun was coming off the rock walls gold and long, and I thought, she is good company for people. She is the kind of person who makes the place better by being in it, who always has been, and whose people knew it, and whose people were gone now. Another afternoon, I came back from checking the approaches, and found her in the open ground near the spring, teaching Nolly to grind corn. Nolly's small hands over hers, the stone going in circles, both of them covered in meal dust to the elbows. Nolly was talking. She had started talking again that week, a lot, making up for lost time, and Saya was listening and occasionally answering with one word that would send the girl off on another long run of whatever was in her mind. I stopped at the edge of the open ground and watched. I thought about the rope that first morning, how Nolly had been shaking and hadn't stopped, how her small dark fingers had gone to bad colors from the cold, and here she was talking about something with meal dust in her hair, and her face turned up to say something to her oldest sister who was still listening, still always listening. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that Nolly saw me. She always saw everything, that child, and waved with both hands, the kind of wave that involves the whole body. Saya looked over. She looked at me for a moment, a real look, not one she was organizing or managing, and I looked back at her, and then Nolly was pulling at her hands to get back to the corn, and she turned to give it her attention. I went on about my business. It took me some time before I could think clearly about anything practical. On the 6th day, I rode out and spent most of a day circling back on our trail, reading sign. I found what I'd hoped to find. The Delgado riders had pressed north, reached the edge of Natani's territory, and stopped. The sign was 2 days old. They'd held at the perimeter and turned back south. Whether they'd give it up entirely or regroup, I couldn't say, but for now they were gone. I rode back and told Saya. She stood still for a moment, then she said, "My sisters are safe." I said yes, for now. She looked at the ground. After a moment she said, "And after, what do we do after?" I told her what I'd been thinking through, that Natani had indicated he was willing to have them stay on if they chose. There was room here and work and people and safety. Or I could help them reach other places, other people, wherever she had ties or thought was best. She listened to all of it, then she said, "What do you do after?" I said I'd had plans for Colorado, land, something to build. She nodded, she said, "That is a long way." I said yes. She looked at me for a long moment. The afternoon light was sideways and gold in the canyon, and it caught her face, and she looked tired and clear-eyed and entirely herself, not asking for anything, not offering anything, just being exactly who she was, which was the kind of person you can see for a long time and not see all of. She said, "Is that what you want, Colorado?" I stood there for a moment with that question in the air between us, and found I didn't know how to answer it the way I would have answered it a month ago. I said I didn't know. She said, "I think you do know." I looked at her, then I said, "Saya." She waited. I said, "I am 51 years old and not an easy man to be around, by most accounts, including my own. I have spent a long time arranging my life so that I didn't owe anyone and no one owed me. And I am standing here realizing that arrangement was solving for the wrong problem." She listened without moving. I said, "I would like to stay, not in a way that makes anything harder for you. I would like to be near, if that's something that makes sense to you, and be useful to you and your sisters, and not require anything from you except the chance to be useful." She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I started to regret the whole of it. Then she said, "You cut 4 people down from a tree and rode 3 days north with 6 men behind you." I said yes. She said, "And now you are asking permission to stay nearby." I said yes. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "In my language, the word for what you did in that canyon, there is not a good Spanish word for it. It means something like, the man who came without being sent for." I said I didn't know if that was a title. She said, "It is how I will say your name from now on, if you stay." I said I thought I would stay. She nodded once. Then she turned and went back to where her sisters were, and Nolly came running across the open ground toward me at full tilt with her arms out, because she was 8 years old and had somewhere to be. And I caught her and swung her up, and she shrieked with it, and I could hear Desta and Kai laughing somewhere close, and the afternoon light was long and gold in the canyon walls. All right, I thought, all right then. There are things that happened in the months after that I am not going to try to tell you in full, because they belong to a different kind of story, slower and quieter, and more complicated than an adventure. The way things actually are when they are actually yours, and you are actually living in them. We went back to lower country in the spring. Not Vitor's range, not anywhere Delgado's men had worked. Further west, up into country that hadn't been claimed in any legal sense yet, which is how most of the land in New Mexico territory existed in those years, as possibility, as someone's future argument. I found a canyon with water and grass, and a south-facing slope where a cabin could go, and where the winter sun would actually reach it, which matters more than most people understand until they've spent a winter in the mountains. We built that cabin, Saya and I, over the course of a long autumn. Natani sent Chuya with us for the first 3 weeks to help with the heavy work, and I paid him in labor I put in on Natani's structures on 2 separate trips back. Kai and Desta and Nolly worked alongside us. Kai turned out to have a better eye for fitting stone than anyone I'd built with, which she seemed to discover at the same moment I did, with the same quality of quiet satisfaction. Desta did the work no one else wanted to do, the grinding, repetitive work, without complaint, because Desta had decided at some point that she was going to be useful and was going to mean it. Nolly got in the way and was underfoot, and was also somehow always exactly where she needed to be when something needed catching or fetching or holding. We had the roof on before the first hard freeze. It was not a beautiful building. It was a solid one, which is better. I have worked that land for 3 winters now, and the cabin is still standing, which in this territory is something you do not take for granted. There is a creek that runs good water even in the dry years. There is a view from the south slope in the evening that I have stood looking at so many times that I have stopped seeing it, and then looked again, and remembered why I stayed. I am not going to make this more than it is. Saya and I are not young people making a young person's life. We are people who have had most of the softness scraped off us by the time we found each other, and what we have is what you have when there's nothing left to pretend with, which is harder in some ways and realer in every way than most of what I had before. We work beside each other. We disagree, sometimes considerably, and settle it without drama because neither of us has the energy for drama and both of us have dealt with things that make disagreements look small. We sit at the end of the day at the same fire and don't need to fill the quiet. That is enough. That is more than I thought I'd have. More than I deserved by the accounting of that man in Abilene with the note in his hand, and I have concluded that man's accounting was wrong. Kai married a man from Natani's settlement the summer after. A young man with a serious face who had clearly been working up to it for months, and who came to me before he came to her sisters, which is how I understood that I had become something to this family that I hadn't set out to become and couldn't have planned. The wedding lasted 3 days. Desta sang at it. I hadn't known Desta could sing, hadn't known what her voice was, and I sat at the fire with Nolly pressed against my side and Saya's shoulder against mine and listened, and thought about a man in Abilene reading a note in an empty house. That man would not know what to do with this, but that man had been wrong about a lot of things. Nolly is 13 now. She is taller than I expected her to be, taller than Desta already, and has opinions about everything. About which horses are worth keeping and which ones are fooling you, about the best route to the lower pasture in the mud season, about whether a particular piece of my fence work is done right, which it usually isn't to her standard, and she will tell me so directly, which I take as a mark of something good between us. She is learning to read from a woman at a settlement 2 days south, which was my idea, which she resisted with considerable passion, which Saya overruled with 3 sentences. She goes down twice a month now, and comes back with books tucked into her saddlebag, and the particular expression of a person who has discovered something they didn't know existed and can't stop thinking about it. She has started teaching Natani's granddaughter letters on the visits they make to us in the summer. I watched her doing this one afternoon in the open ground south of the cabin, Nolly with a stick drawing shapes in the dirt, the other girl watching, and I thought, she is going to be a remarkable person. She already is. I just get to watch the rest of it happen. She still comes to me first when something is wrong. Not Saya, not her sisters, me. She comes and finds me wherever I am and stands nearby without saying the thing immediately, and I have learned over the years to wait, to keep working at whatever I'm doing and let her circle around to it in her own time. She gets there. She always gets there, knowing what someone needs and giving it to them without making it cost them anything. That is, I've come to believe, the whole of the work of being someone people can trust. I don't know what I am to her in her language, in her heart. I know what I am in practice. I'm the one she looks for. Last winter the creek froze in a way it hadn't in years. We lost a horse to it, went through thin ice in a cut that I should have fenced in the fall and didn't because there were other things pressing, and I'd miscalculated how cold it would get that early. That's on me. I knew it while it was happening and I couldn't stop it, and I knew it was on me. And there are few things that sit worse than watching something go wrong that you could have prevented if you'd been smarter about it 2 months earlier. The horse was a bay gelding I'd been working for 4 years. He wasn't sentimental to me the way a man gets sentimental about dogs. I'm not built that way, but he was a good horse, reliable and honest about what he'd give you, and losing a horse like that to bad planning is its own particular kind of stupid tax. on top of the practical loss. It was a bad week. Nolly cried, which she doesn't do easily, and then was angry about crying, which is very like her. Desta and Kai rode out from their place and helped with the creek fence work and didn't say much about anything, which was exactly right. Saya handled what needed handling with the same economy she handled everything, and I stayed out of her way and did the outside work and let the bad week be what it was. At the end of it, I was at the fire late, bone-tired in the way 54-year-old bones are tired after a week of cold and hard work and feeling like a fool. The fire was burning down and I hadn't moved to build it back up, and I was sitting there with my hands on my knees thinking about nothing much, which is how I know I'm more tired than I should admit. Saya came and sat beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't address the horse or the week or the fence I should have put up in October. After a moment, she reached over and put her hand on mine where it was resting on my knee. Just that, her hand on mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her hand on mine in the firelight. The sound of the creek outside running under the ice. All four of them somewhere close, Nolly in the cabin, Kai and her husband at their own place down the slope, Desta with them. Safe, warm, here. I thought about that rope, warm in my hands that gray morning, what I'd cut loose and what I hadn't known I'd cut loose at the same time. I thought about the long, cold ride north with 6 men behind us and 4 people depending on me to know what I was doing, and how I hadn't always known but had kept moving because there wasn't anything else to do. I'd been needed, not in the small way, not the way a hired hand is needed or a useful stranger, but in the bone way. The real way. The way that means when you are gone there is a shape left where you were. I had been needed and I had been enough for it. Saya's hand on mine. The fire burning down. The cold outside, and the creek running under the ice and the long dark, and everything inside the cabin warm. I blew out the lamp. The dark was warm,